don't have to be the immigration police. So that finally in America, we can actually know who came here legally on a visa, but overstayed their visa, because 40% of the people in this country that are undocumented are here who came legally and overstayed. We still can't do that in America because that bill passed the Senate, but it couldn't get a vote in the House because of the stupidest rule ever created called the Hastert Rule, named after somebody who's in prison. That has allowed a minority of tyrants in the Congress to bring a Democratic president low, President Obama, who they didn't let do anything, and to ruin the speakership of John Boehner, and to allow Paul Ryan to almost accomplish nothing while he was speaker, except leaving this place in a government shutdown. The so-called Freedom Caucus. And the so-called Freedom Caucus has had a veto around this place for 10 years, Madam President. Completely distorted the Republican Party here. If I do say so myself, that may sound presumptuous, but I know a lot of Republicans in Colorado who don't agree with almost anything that the Freedom Caucus has stood for. Yet they have had a veto on good bipartisan legislation passed by the United States Senate. So I'm not going to stand here and take it from somebody who shut the government down while my state was flooded, or from a president who's saying he wants $5 billion to build some antiquated medieval wall that he said Mexico would pay for, when I helped write and voted for a bill that actually would have secured the border of the United States of America. That would have secured our internal defenses as well. This is a joke. And the fact that it consumes, the cable networks all night, every night, and all the rest of it, this government should be open. We can debate whatever it is we want to debate. Do you think that the Chinese don't know that we can't land a spaceship on the dark side of the moon? Do you think the Russians don't know that for the first time since John Glenn was sent up to orbit this planet, America cannot put a person into space without asking the Russians to do it? Do you think the rest of the world doesn't know that we're not investing in our infrastructure? That we're not investing in the young generation of Americans? That we're willing to lose the race for artificial intelligence to the Chinese? That we're going to break all of our long-standing alliances since World War II at a moment when China is rising? That China's GDP has quadrupled since 2001, tripled since 2003, doubled since 2009. Do we think that no one in the rest of the world knows all of that about us? We should reopen this government, Madam President, today. We should open it today. And then what I hope much more than that is that we actually come together to figure out how we're going to govern this country again. And stop playing petty partisan politics that are going to do nothing to educate the next generation of Americans. That are going to do nothing to fix the fiscal condition of this country. For 10 years. For 10 years. Madam President, I've heard the junior senator from Texas, I've heard the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives talk about how important it is to get the fiscal condition of our government fixed. In fact, that's been the pretext for shutdowns and for fiscal cliffs and for all this stuff that does nothing but denigrate our democratic republic. And now, Madam President, for the first time almost in history, it happened once before during the Vietnam War, for the first time almost in history, we are actually having our deficit shooting through the roof while unemployment is falling. Never happened before. And these are the people who called Barack Obama a Bolshevik and a socialist, and at the depths of the recession when we had a 10% unemployment rate, didn't lift a finger to do anything. They have now given us a fiscal condition where our deficit is going up while our unemployment rate is falling. Do you know how hard, Madam President, it is to accomplish that? Do you know how irresponsible you would have to be to accomplish that? Yet, that's what's been accomplished. When I was first here, this is actually a little after I was first here, I used to walk through Denver International Airport, which we're very proud of in Colorado. By the way, it is the most recent airport that's been constructed in America. While we've been closed, other airports around the world, new airports, have been opened. Just while we've been closed. So Denver International Airport is the most recent airport in the country to be open. It was opened 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. And during moments like when the senator from Texas shut the government down while Colorado was underneath floods and people had lost all the things that I talked about earlier, their houses, their jobs, and their lives, I used to want to walk through that airport with a paper bag over my head because I was so embarrassed to be part of this. And I often wondered, Madam President, why anyone would, in their right mind, want to work in a place that has a 9% approval rate. In fact, I brought out a chart, two charts one day to the floor, one that showed that we hadn't always had the 9% approval rating, to remind people how far we had fallen in the public's estimation over the time that the senator from Texas and I have been here. And then I brought another chart out that looked at who else has a 9% approval rating. And I can't remember all of it. It's sort of been lost in the mist of time, but I do remember that the IRS had a 40% approval rating. There was an actress who had a 13% approval rating. More people wanted America to be a communist country, 11%, than approved of this country. And Fidel Castro had a 5% approval rating, which was lower than our 9% approval rating. He was the only one who had a lower rating than that. And so my question often was, why would anybody want to work in a place that has such a low approval rating? And why would they want to behave in a way that only made matters worse? And I'm sorry to say this, Madam President, but there is an answer. If you think you have been sent here to dismantle the federal government, which I have lots of problems with, this federal government, I don't think it does a lot of things very well. And as a Westerner, I certainly believe we need to not be in the business of defending bad government. We need to be improving the government. But if you think your job is to dismantle it, as the Freedom Caucus does, in my view, then a 9% approval rating suits you just fine because you get to go home and say, see how terrible all those guys are? See what idiots all those guys are? While you're taking your pay, while the federal workers are not getting paid, while you're keeping your job, while they're losing their job. And there has been an effort, not just to dismantle the federal government, but to separate it from the American people. To claim that it's someone else's, or that because it's corrupt, and in many ways I think it is. I believe it is. I believe this place is one of the most corrupt parts of the whole thing. But because it's corrupt, or because it can't get its act together, or because it's too far away from the people, or because I would say because it's populated by a bunch of self-interested politicians who don't care about the priorities of the American people. But whatever the reason is, it's not separate. It is not separate. And the reason that's important is that we live in a democratic republic. And the founders of this country, who did two things that had never happened in human history. They led a successful armed insurrection against a colonial power in one generation. And they formed a democratic republic whose constitution was ratified by the people who would live under it. And what they knew, because they were Enlightenment thinkers, or I should say not what they knew, what they believed, because they had only bad examples from which to draw when they sat there in Philadelphia writing that Constitution. But what they knew was, in a republic, we would have disagreements. That was their expectation. And their belief was that out of those disagreements, we would and by the way, they knew we'd have disagreements because they had disagreements. And they failed on some very important things, it has to be said. They perpetuated human slavery because they couldn't come to an agreement about that. And other people who I think of as founders just as important, just as significant as those founders, ended the enslavement of human beings in America and did other important things, like make sure my daughters had the right to vote. Those people also are founders. But what they believed at their core was that through our disagreements, we would forge more imaginative and more durable solutions than any king or tyrant could come up with on their own. That was their belief. That was their expectation. And I would say our country, in many ways, has eclipsed any expectation they ever had of what America would become. For the moment, we're the richest country in the world. We have the greatest capacity for self-defense of any human population in the history of the world. We are far more democratic and far more free with all of our imperfections than they would have ever imagined, and probably than most of them would have ever wanted. We are the longest lived democracy in human history. But for some reason, there is a generation of politicians in America today who don't think it's necessary to live up to the standard that they set, and that the standard lots of other people have set from the founding of our country 230 years ago until today. I don't even know what day it is anymore of this record-long shutdown. the pretext for it is an invention. It's a creation of something in the president's mind. It was something we've learned from reading the press. There was a mnemonic device used during the campaign to remind him to talk about immigration in an effort to divide Americans from one another, instead of in an effort to bring us together. In an effort to turn what just 3 years ago was a bipartisan issue in the Senate, securing our southern border with $46 billion, into a cudgel to be wielded at campaign rallies. And in any case, the least we could do while we have these shabby disagreements that aren't worthy of our predecessors, are not worthy of the state I represent, which is a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third independent, are threatening to make our generation, the first generation of Americans, to leave less opportunity, not more, for the people coming after us. A generation of politicians who are openly suggesting that America's role in the world should be diminished. The least we could do is reopen our government and stop pursuing the self-inflicted harm that it creates to have hundreds of thousands of federal workers out of work and not being paid, not able to support their families, while we continue to stand on this floor having mindless arguments that are going to do nothing to advance the future of our country. We shouldn't shut the government down, as it has been in this case, for a campaign promise the president, I'm sure, knew he could never keep. With that, Madam President, I yield.